Here is a gray shimmering ink by Pelikan Edelstein Moonstone.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
In reality, I filmed this much sooner than it's being released, and it's largely because of the amount of disappointment for this ink. It really always needs to be said that gray is a hard color to get right. And here Pelikan got the gray ink right, but then masked it with shimmer and didn't do a great job. What you see now is the darkest and only really good viewing of the shimmer. Although it does, it does show up. This is probably the best view. There is tone variation, and a majority of it is really good. Like a pencil, just ruined with shimmer in this case. I do enjoy shimmering inks, but I really think Pelikan is lost on how to do shimmer well. This is a hard pass.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M1000. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, the tone that we get on the paper is just a little bit lighter than a pencil the way I would prefer to see it, but it is a very nice gray that we're getting. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading, not to put you out on this, but not put out on the second line really does show the shading very well. The N is a nice mid-tone, the O gets lighter, the T much darker, and it's very close, not quite to pencil, but very close. Put has a bunch of slight tone variations in the PU, and the T is much darker, where out does a nice gentle shading from lighter into darker at the T. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. And the tone itself is really spot on for pencil. I tend to circle a couple of words with pencil, and it's not really noticeable between the two of them. We get no feathering, and we get no spread, and we get branches of shading that's going on. Looking at branches on the second line, which starts as a nice darker tone, lightens up on the NC, much darker at the HES at the end, really does a good job. They had this right. Looking at had on the second line, light to dark to light. Now, the thing is, in every space where it's a little bit darker, you do get some of that shimmer, and depending on the angle you're looking at, has it sort of lose some of the pencil effect. It's like you're writing with a glittery pencil. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It kept the shading very nicely. Looking at kept on the second line, the K being darker, lightening up at the E, slightly darker at the P, lightly out of the P, very dark into the T, spreading some of this nice shading around. Looking at spreading still on the second line. It starts darker, works its way lighter, very dark at the A, lightening up again, and then very dark at the G. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. The tone on this paper really is quite good. It looks very much like pencil, especially from this extra fine nib, and a kind of smoke effect in the shading. Looking at smoke, a horrible connection there. The S is a little bit darker. It lightens up in the middle, much darker again at the E, really piling it on. Look at piled directly above it, which is for the most part a darker word, yet it still shows some tone variation, with the PI being a nice mid-tone. L very dark down into the mid-tone at the L and beginning of the D, dark at the end of the D. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, just outside of that pencil range to me here. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It's bringing the heat when it comes to shading. Look at heat. First line, the top of the H is lighter than the bottom of the H. The bottom of the H and the E are much darker. The A is a whole lot lighter, and the T is very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Forgot to mention that. Round and round it goes when it comes to shading. Look at round and round, top line. The first round is largely a darker tone, but at the U, it lightens up a little bit. Same with the beginning of the D, and goes lighter to darker to lighter to darker. 4 tone shifts in a 3-letter word, where round starts lighter and gradually works its way darker just the slightest bit until the up and down of the D that is much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. Really right on that pencil color here, and it still looks as a gray pencil with no feathering, with no spread, with spears of shading that jump out at you. Look at with spears on the second line. The width starts lighter, works its way darker. The top of the T and the end of the H much darker. Where spears, the S is light, the P is dark, E is dark, A, R, S just working their way lighter till the end of the S that gets much darker again. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, just outside that perfect pencil range. However, it's still a very nice gray. Something to be said on this paper is it's really absorbing away the shimmer, making it stay much more as a pencil as it is for an ink. So doing a great job with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that isn't horrible. Looking at horrible on the second line. The H is darker, lighter at the O. The R's both shift a little bit darker each. The I lightening up. The F gets much darker till the bottom when it lightens up into the L. The E being very dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that is a breeze. Looking at breeze on the first line, it starts a bit darker at the BR, lightens up. The bottom of the first E is much darker than the rest of it, stays light through to the last E that is much darker. They did a very nice job with this, looking at they on the second line, where you see the T and the bottom of the H is much lighter, top of the H is much darker, E is light again. The Y does a shifting from light to very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread. The tone almost perfect, similar to the way I said the almost, but the slight tone shift of the paper itself brings the tone of the ink that much closer to looking like pencil. They really did a good job. Look at Pot on the second line. Nice mid-tone, lightening up at the O, very dark at the T. Same with them on the third line. The T is a mid-tone, H is very dark, lightening up through the E, M. Doing a beautiful job. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still just managing to hold on to that right in that it's a pencil look on the page as a result of the slightly different white of the paper. No feathering, no spread, little birds of shading showing up. Looking at little birds on the first line, you see the two L's of little are a bit darker than the rest of the word. On birds, it's mostly a lighter tone, except the I and R, which are slightly darker, and same with the end of the S. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine. Really shifts out of that kind of perfect pencil tone here. No feathering, no spread, little bit of shading. Look at little on the first line. You see the crosses of the T's are a bit darker. Same with the dot of the I. It isn't enough to make you sing. Looking at you sing on the second line, where the Y starts light, gets dark within the Y. Coming out to the O and beginning of the U, very light, and the end of the U, quite dark. Where sing starts as a lighter tone, becomes a mid-tone at the end, lightens up at the beginning of the G, back to a mid-tone in the G, and the dot, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Bookbinder's Ground Rattler Snake. Here is Diatramentis Silver Gray. Here is Diamine Moondust. Here is Pilot Fuyu Soyugan, or Rigor of Winter. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, the thing is, the very different white that we're getting here, it really looks much more like pencil than it did on the Clairfontaine, even though the tone of the ink is the same. So slight effect from the paper. No feather, no spread. The shade is not punishing you, but it is there. Look at punishing, far right of the second line. The P is a darker mid-tone, lightening up through most of the word, SH becoming a little bit darker and lightening up at the ED of punish. Dot, very dark. It's shading, I think, very nicely. Make on the third line is a beautiful mid-tone till you get to the E at the end that is much darker. Really looks a whole lot like pencil there. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, little lighter than on the Clairfontaine, and yet even though the tone wouldn't be perfect itself to be pencil, with this paper, I think it does a great job of really looking like it could be. no feather, no spread, not a wizard making shading happen. But if we look at wizard on the second line, we see a nice mid-tone with the WI, and the beginning of the Z lightens up. The end part of the Z gets a bit darker, and it stays darker till the beginning of the D, that it lightens up very dark at the end of the D. Though, looking at though, you see the top part of the T is very dark, bottom is very light, H is quite dark and lightens up through the rest of the word. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. The tone, and I think it's because of the stub nib here, doesn't really pass for me as pencil. I think the color is right, but it's the stub that kind of takes that away from it. No feather, no spread. It does shade like the light, or like light the night. I missed my mark. Light the night on the second line. The L is a nice mid-tone. It works through on that mid-tone till the H, where it lightens up a little bit. The T very dark, where the right next to it, mostly a darker tone, but the bottom of the TH very light. And night, light tone, little bit darker at the second part of the N, lightens up again through most of the word, very dark at the T, showing some nice shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Ackerman, their number 9 Indigo Blue. Here is a magenta ink by Private Reserve Burgundy Mist. Here is a green ink by Noodler's Texas Live Oak. Here is a purple ink by Robert Oster Summer Storm. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, about the tone that we had with the medium on the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get some feathering and we do get some spread. The feathering and the spread is not an issue and not something that would stop you from using it on this paper. The shading is present. Look at skin crack on the second line. It starts darker, works its way lighter through skins. Crack starts lighter and works its way dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. The shading is absolutely a delight. Looking at delight on the third line, where it's mostly a mid-tone, but the part of the G is a little bit darker. The H is a little bit darker. The bottom of the T a slight bit lighter, darker at the end of the T. I think the shading that we're getting here really is quite reminiscent of pencil. And again, with the cheaper papers, there's nothing coming through as far as shimmer. Many of these papers didn't show a whole lot for shimmer. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. Or at least, if it's there, I'm not really seeing it. This is an amazing thing, as if Gandalf went and did this himself. Looking at Gandalf to try and see shading, you see there's very little. The G is only slightly darker than the AN, and the D darkens just a little bit, and a very slight lightening through most of the rest of the word. Top of the F is a little bit darker than the bottom of the F. The shading that we're mostly seeing is like that. Very gentle, very little, and it's kind of elegant in what's happening, especially considering it's copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is really not a problem on this paper with this ink, though the ink does get deep into the paper, and personally, I wouldn't want to write on the other side. I think you could if you really wanted to. I wouldn't, but I think you could, and I don't think it'll ruin everything. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine is just a tad light to be a perfect pencil match, while the medium and the stub both might be the perfect pencil tone matched perfectly. I think I said that backwards. All three cases, the shimmer is not especially helpful. So go for a gusher of a broad to, one, help darken this up a little bit and to get more of the shimmer on the page. I think it looks its best as a showing off the shimmer than just as a gray with shimmer.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.